Look, I was thinking back to the first Green Building Summit that I spoke at. I think that was 2018. And my main reflection is what has changed in the last 3 years is we've gone from denying there's a problem and that there are ways of doing things better to going, how can we get on with it and do it better? And that movement towards action, I think, is really good, but I think one of our big focuses going forward has to be about how do we get government on board, because individually we can do lots of good things, but it's not enough to do individual stuff. We've got to change systems. We don't have time. So today I wanted to speak pretty simply about what is the future of the green economy. And within this, of course, housing, transport, our urban system, where we live, how we live, is absolutely critical, because that is where most of the opportunities are. Everything that we've experienced in the last year or so with COVID, what we experienced with the earthquake in Canterbury, what we're experiencing with climate change, can only be described as a crisis. And what we've learned in the last 12 months is that actually when there is a crisis and it's immediate and it's urgent, we're absolutely capable, both as a government and as a country, to take action. That's bold, that's relatively coherent, coordinated, and all those other bits and pieces, and they give results. We have a template of what we can do and what we should do. The question is, will we apply to climate change like we should? I want to start a little bit with the pandemic because I think it provides a good stage. And I'm also very fearful that in this and future budgets, what we will see is this crisis will be the excuse for not doing more. And I would be extremely disappointed if that is the case, because everything of the last 12 months shows us that we can do what is right. That is right for the population, that's right for the economy, it's right for society. And when COVID first hit, I was actually holed up already because I had a cold and I didn't know if I had COVID, right? So I was already self-isolating before the lockdown happened. So I had lots of time to read lots of stuff and also look back through previous pandemics and previous big recessions. So we had some pretty good ideas of what would happen over the course of the next 12 months and what we needed to do. And so one of the things that really came through for us was you needed to have urgent, immediate action to get on top of it. You can't wait for it to take hold and then try and deal with it. And by and large, that's exactly what happened. When it comes to the number of cases, what we saw is that we just started to sort of import a few cases, but we had the lockdowns pretty soon and we had the border closure. Now, when the border closure first happened, it was absolutely gobsmacking to me that we would do that. It was so out of the ordinary. It was such an extraordinary policy change that we would actually close our borders to everybody but our citizens and residents was a huge step. But that, I think, is an example of us being able to make changes and break away from the status quo if we want to. And the result was very much that we saved thousands of lives. If you look to the right-hand side, if we had followed what had happened in other countries on a per capita basis, we would have had 6, 7, 9,000 deaths already. These are real human lives that we would have lost if we hadn't taken that action. And our priority was, how do we make sure that we do the right thing for the people of New Zealand? And then we do a whole bunch of other things around the same time to make sure that we are able to look after the people as well. And that's really important because I think what happened was there was a lot of fear at the time, right? I mean, we were worried that we would have a big slowdown in the economy, there'd be a huge amount of job losses. How would people respond? We weren't sure. And yet what we found was our economy was extraordinarily flexible. In a normal kind of time period, we'll see about 500,000 people work from home. When the lockdowns happened, 1 million people worked from home. So there was a doubling of people working from home. So not every job can be done from home and all those kinds of things, right? But what was really striking to me was just how responsive we can be when we are asked to do something different. Humans have an extraordinary capacity for flexibility and adaptability. So there is this incredible fear-mongering that goes on with climate change or anything else. Oh, but we can't make such a big step shift too soon. Everything will break. And yet our experience was we could do things different, we could be flexible, we could be adaptable. But it doesn't stick if you don't put in other things in place. And what we saw was once the lockdowns ended, do you know how many more people are still working from home compared to that time? 60,000 people. That's it. What's unusual, of course, is if you look around the world in places like the US and UK in particular, and many parts of Europe, the number of people who are working from home is much, much larger than it is here, because they're still going through the ravages of the pandemic. But also the conversations there are much more advanced around, will this be the death of cities? Do we still want to live in dense places and all those other things? But I think the experience in New Zealand is once we get on top of this, actually people want to go back to work. We still want to do the human stuff. The reason why it's so nice to be in an actual conference rather than in a virtual Zoom conference is because it has better impact, right? We're humans. We enjoy and crave this human connection. I don't think that the pandemic is going to be a death of cities. I don't think the pandemic is going to be a death of urban areas. But I think what it will do is it will change the way we do things. And that's fine. But the big thing for me was when the pandemic happened, we had this incredible fear that there would be this devastation in the economy, but we didn't see that. If anything, what we saw in New Zealand, our economy was down about 3% in 2020, which is not bad compared to many other countries. Because not only do we see the lockdowns when we weren't able to go out and do stuff, also our trading partners have been affected. So their economies have been hurt and our economy has been hurt as a result. But if you look at that chart on the right-hand side, essentially that plots deaths and economic activity. There is no relationship. Whether you locked down the economy or not, it didn't matter. You had to do the thing that was right for your people, and that would have been the better outcome. And the reason why our economic impact was not nearly as negative as many other places is not just because we had a health response that was extraordinary, we also had coordinated response from every part of government. There was this extraordinary amount of relief when it came to interest rates, the changes to the banking system, on lending, all those other bits and pieces. That was extraordinarily important. So we weren't the only ones who did it, but in New Zealand what happened was we got on top of the public health issue as well as the public policy tools that were being pulled when it came to banking, when it came to government. We're going to be spending tens of billions of dollars in the response to COVID. We have the ability to spend lots of money if we want to, if we know there is a crisis. The crisis was immediate, and that's why we spent the money. The crisis of the climate is also a crisis, but it's not immediate enough. Therein lies the challenge. Right now, we're going through two big issues. One is our thinking of the economy and management of the economy is very tied to the idea that there are a bunch of technocratic economist boffins who sit at the Reserve Bank and they manage the economy. That is complete and utter BS. It is not true. Interest rates are so low, what they do there doesn't matter anymore. It just doesn't matter. Oh, it's cheap or cheaper. I don't care. What matters is where they're going to lend the money. Is it still going to be for us to buy and sell second-hand houses? Or is it going to be for us to actually do things, invest in the economy and bits of the economy that is going to be transformative? That is the big question. The next few decades is not going to be about the price of money, is going to be the allocation of money. If we can't get on top of creating proper incentives to direct more of our money into the green parts of our economy, into the transformative parts of our economy, we will fail. We cannot leave it to the Reserve Bank to do this because they're technocrats. We need our political masters and our political system to be able to change that. So the Reserve Bank has lost its relevance. The changes and the policies and regulations the Reserve Bank will implement will be driven by what we want and what our politicians put in place. We've also seen the government unleash huge amounts of money. The initial unleashing of money was very much around the wage subsidy and those kinds of things. That was the safety net stuff, right? So that's fine. The next lot of spending is all about how do we build back better. Except, of course, what we've heard so far is a whole bunch of words, but not much action yet. Shovel-ready projects are not very shovel-ready, it turns out. When it comes to actually looking after the people who could do with more support, we've really pulled back. The freeze on public sector wages, for example, is outrageous. The public sector has proven itself to actually do a really good job. In fact, the public sector did the heavy lifting in terms of helping New Zealand navigate its way through the pandemic. And yet, we've got a government that's willing to freeze their pay. What sort of signal does it send? What kind of economist would design such a policy? Well, of course, economists are not in charge. That's probably not a bad thing. But what we are seeing is a change in the way that government works. And the way that we're seeing the change is the more interventionist, more involved nature of government. Because the Reserve Bank is no longer so relevant, and I think it will come as a great disappointment to those people at the terrace, but the reality is that power is very firmly and concentrated in the beehive. It is going to be what happens in government, by politicians, that is going to matter. The type of intervention will change depending on who's in there in power at the time, but we cannot change the fact that it is the time of government, it is the time of government intervention and government policy which will make the biggest impact going forward. Now, while we had this incredibly urgent and bold action when it came to the immediate response to COVID, when it comes to climate change, housing, inequality, in fact, what we find is the response is slow and cautious, and arguably far too slow and far too cautious. This gives you a sense of where we are in terms of the senses of the level of crisis that we are at today. New Zealand has for a long time told us a story and sold us a dream that New Zealand is a home-owning democracy. Except that dream hasn't been true for a very long time. I mean, you've heard me say this many times. The home ownership rate in New Zealand rose after the wars until a peak in '91, has been falling since then, and now it's the lowest level since the 1950s. We've given up decades and decades of progress in a very short period of time. When you look at what's going on with climate change, I mean, you keep have to changing the scale of the chart to be able to fit it all in, right? That's the extent of the crisis that we see. The science is not in dispute. None of this stuff is in dispute. The problem is well defined. The solutions, the practical solutions in terms of what we have to do are also known. What's missing is how do we move from this track to the other track? What are we going to do to stop bad things from happening and encourage good things to happen? That's what's missing. We can't wait for other people to just do it because the magic just doesn't happen. Economic systems, the way we do things, is based on huge amounts of inertia. You must see this in your own lives, right? We know we should do things differently. Yes, we should take our Keep cup to the cafe, but quite often I forget, right? Maybe you don't, but I have a real long, large stack of Keep cups in my cupboard. So I'm not sure if the embodied emissions in that are worse than the actual cups. What is striking to me now is that there is this incredible opportunity, not just because of COVID, but because of what is happening around the world in terms of the way we think about economics, policy, and politics. I think we're living through a big change in regimes. This only happens every so often. It's infrequent. If you look back through history, the Great Depression was a huge catalyst for change. The building of the welfare state, the way that we did things with social housing or housing New Zealanders, or the way we look after unemployed New Zealanders, investment in skills, education, that really came out of the Great Depression. And then we saw a big shift in the way that we managed the economy through the exchange rate crisis that happened. And then we had the oil shocks and stagflation that happened, and that really kind of ushered in the current era of the way we think about the economy. There is no right and wrong of it. There was no perfect system, right? These systems change over time because we're dealing with different issues and different problems. Every generation has something that's different that it deals with. And with the GFC and now the pandemic, this last decade, I think, has bookended the end of the reforms that we saw in the 1980s. That period is done. Nobody talks about trickle-down economics anymore because they're stupid, right? Now we talk about what are we going to do different, because we've had 30 years of experience saying that actually we're not going to reduce poverty by doing more of the same. Actually, we're not going to deal with the structural problems that are in the economy by doing more of the same. It doesn't mean the reforms of the 1980s were wrong, because there were many other things that were broken in New Zealand, and we don't want Muldoon to come back, right? Whether from the grave or not. I think the next phase is very much like what we saw in the post-war era, that it is a period of nation building. Because what characterized the last 40 years is a huge amount of underinvestment in our social and physical infrastructure. So the period of the 90s and pretty much until about 2000, 2002, we were underinvesting in our infrastructure, even physical infrastructure, by a huge amount. Whether it's houses or roads or bridges and pipes, we are probably short $75 to $100 billion. We're talking big amounts of dollars that we just didn't keep up. And now we're paying the price of that, right? That's why there is literally shit running down the roads of Wellington, and we have congestion on our roads, and we have bridges that are too small for the population because we didn't keep up and we didn't plan ahead. So nation building is going to be a pretty big part, but for nation building to work, you're going to have a consensus of what you want to change. This is a slightly wonky chart, but I love using this because I think it really shows us why our public narrative in New Zealand must be very different and why we can't pursue a politics of division. When we had the change in those big regimes, for example, the post-war era, the greatest generation, they came back from the war, they experienced the Great Depression, and they said, we don't want that. We want something different. The investments that took place at the time, we're looking at 100 years. And so the greatest generation was more than half of the voting public at the time. So their concerns, their values, their way of life actually was very important. It was by the greatest generation for their values. So they had consensus in terms of what they were going to do. In the 1980s, we had the boomers as the biggest generation, and it was their concerns, their fear of hyperinflation, of big government, of Muldoon, of all those crazy things that were going on in that period. It was their fears and their values that made those changes. Fast forward to today, there is no big generation. There is no one big group that can dominate the public narrative. There is no one big group that can dominate politics. Now we have to find consensus across a wide range of people, wide range of values, wide range of concerns. Therein lies the opportunity and risk. It's much easier to go, your generation is screwed. If you rise up, we can fix this. But if I unscrew you, this other generation gets screwed, right? The politics becomes much more like a tennis game. And therein lies, I think, one of the biggest challenges. Like COVID, we have to find some way to be able to cut through all that crap and go, how do we make it relevant for all New Zealanders, not because you have grey hair or you don't have grey hair. Something has to shift because our politics is still pretty juvenile, right? Because what we hear too much of is how we're going to do this and we're going to undo that. Well, if you're going to do that kind of tennis game kind of politics, it's not going to work. When it comes to climate change, we know that there is a huge amount of work to do. I know you had the Climate Change Commission come and speak to you today. The work that they've been doing is extraordinary. And there'll be economists that will go, oh, I don't like the modeling here or modeling there. It doesn't matter. What really matters is we need coordinated action that's based on some sort of evidence, and we have some feedback loops, right? The thing that concerns me right now is so much of our conversation is tied up around what's happening in electricity sector or what's happening specifically in transport, but we're not talking about it still as the wider system of how we live and where we live and how we live. Because that's really what it is, right? Because it's the way that we live our lives that's the problem here. And I will give you a little bit of an example of the case study of the rebuild from Christchurch, because I think that really exemplifies how that worked really well in some places and we locked in 100 years of emissions. That is absolutely terrible. The biggest problem in terms of where the emissions are growing in New Zealand is really households. It's us driving around, living further and further away, and driving further and further in our cars. That's really the big driver. And if you look at the increase in household emissions, it's over the last 10 years, it's only really grown for transport. Every other type of emission has generally come down or has stayed the same because the things that we buy, the things that we use are generally getting better, right? They're becoming more efficient in all those bits and pieces. So we just have to be really mindful that when we think about the economy, we are far too often talking about the nuts and bolts of the factories and this and that. Much more of the emissions are about how we live, where we live, and how we get to work and other places. It's that overlap and that nexus where I think the biggest opportunity is. I've been doing a whole bunch of work in Canterbury lately because of a project that I'm doing, but I think it's a really good example, regardless of how we can do things right, but also how when we make mistakes, those mistakes can last for a very long time. Do you remember when the earthquake happened, there was all this kind of fear that everybody would leave and the place would be empty? Well, it wasn't true, right? Because what happened was, yes, there was a bit of an outflow for a couple of years after the earthquakes. These are people who would have probably left anyway because they were going to retire to Nelson or Wanaka or whatever. Good for them, right? Because to be fair, Wanaka and Nelson and Tasman is a bit nicer. I can say that because I grew up in Christchurch. Don't tell them, don't report back. But essentially what happened after that is we had massive amounts of population growth. So the economy was extraordinarily productive. The economy was growing really fast because of the amount of money we were investing in the economy. So when people go, oh, the greening of the economy is going to be terrible because all these industries will close. Did you forget the greening of the economy actually comes with bucket loads of investments? The only way we can green the economy is if we invest huge amounts of money in the economy. It's the only way we can green our economy. That investment will far outweigh any of the negative shocks of dinosaur industries that die. Of course, we should do policies that help people and ease the burden of that shock, but it doesn't mean that on net, the economy will be smaller. Christchurch is a great example of that. The difference, of course, is we had that external source of funds from the insurance money, which really, really helped break it. Whereas for us, for greening of the economy, we actually have to borrow money or pay more taxes or something like that. Now, while we had this extraordinary population growth and extraordinary success because of that massive rebuild and rebuilding of Canterbury, where the rebuilding happened wasn't where we were before. And you can see on the map, all those orange bits and red bits are where all the houses were built. I was there yesterday and this morning, and I drove out to Rolleston, I drove out to Rangiora. It takes like 15, 20 minutes from the city centre, right? Why wouldn't you drive? Why would you spend $650,000 to buy a house in Christchurch City when you could spend $650,000 in Canterbury, in Rolleston, for a 4-bedroom Mac mansion with a pool? Right? People do. It turns out people are rational. But it also means you're driving a lot every single day. And once you build a house, it's probably going to be around for 100 years. So we're going to live like this for 100 years. So when Canterbury rebuilt, we baked in 100 years of increased emissions. So lots of things went right in Christchurch, and lots of things didn't. We prioritized the short term over the long term, and therein lies the big challenge. Canterbury has one of the highest rates of people who travel to work by car. It makes sense because it's really far and it's really easy. Everything is 15 minutes away, right? And it's wonderful if you can. If there were no costs to driving, it would be wonderful. Except we know, of course, that that's not the case. And in Canterbury, their biggest challenges, well, they also have lots of emissions-intensive parts of the economy, like primary industries and whatnot. But the biggest growth, and the only part of the economy that's growing in terms of emissions, is households. It's people, where they live, and how much they drive, that's driving that increase in emissions. So, what were the lessons from Canterbury? What were the lessons from COVID, and how do we pull it all together? What worked in Canterbury was really quite interesting. Most of the plans of where they were going to build and how they were going to build was already done. In 2007, they had done a strategy of where all the new builds would go for the next 50 years. The only problem was they did it all in 3. So that strategy is now spent. But so there was very coordinated in terms of those ideas and policies. And government stepped in and said, look, the barriers we currently have to policy, like the RMA, we're going to sidestep that with the CERA Act and the LERP that they put in. Now, acronyms from here to Africa, but essentially the government stepped in and said, we will enable you to do this. And we could do it because the money was also available, both from insurance money and from government when it comes to infrastructure. And so that really made, I think, a big difference. There was a coordinated approach across the region. There was coherence when it came to public policy, both at central government, local government, funding, all of those things tied up, and the market just responded. We needed tens of thousands of houses, and we got tens of thousands of houses. It worked. But we also baked in these other things, because when we gave the money, we didn't say that it must be carbon neutral. We didn't say it should be sustainable. We didn't say it should also deal with poor people. And so it means that those things got left out. When I think about climate change and the opportunity for what we are here to talk about today is ultimately it's not just about the building, but it's about where and how we live. Right? So we already know that if you build a good quality house, the cost of your energy and all those things will fall. I was talking to the guys at Sally's because I'm on the board of community finance, and we facilitated the funding for their big new projects. So they're doing SIPs, so the quality of the buildings is really, really high, very green buildings. And the cost of heating in winter is half of a normal house for their clients. So for this very poor and vulnerable households, huge impact. And it's not just that the cost of heating is half, the air is drier, the air is healthier, people are healthier. So all those other benefits that we know exist are absolutely there. I think we need to talk about everything as a system, and it needs to be about how and where we live. And it has to be there that we start with a lot of the changes that come. Otherwise, we'll be locking things in. If you agree with me that we are seeing a change in regimes and that this new regime, hopefully, can be our next bit of nation building, I would say the big opportunities is for us to think about our rules and regulations. We must get government to work on our behalf. We cannot have rules and regulations that allow us to essentially go, we're going to favor lending to buy and sell existing houses over every other type of investment in New Zealand. Right? We're going to create no incentives for you to invest in green technologies, green capital. Why not? Why can we not have incentives? And why can we not have also the stick that says if you want to do those other things that we don't like, we're going to make it really expensive and really difficult. But policies have to be coordinated. So when we did the Canterbury rebuild, the problem was we didn't coordinate. We did the stuff around actual building houses, but we didn't bring in our lens of climate change. We didn't bring our lens of equity in terms of what impact it has on different parts of society. There's a lack of coherence in the way that we do public policy in New Zealand, right? There's a little bit here, a little bit there, but we don't know how those things fit. And if we can't have that coherence across everything, it's very difficult. And we need actual money to be spent in the right things. Green finance has to be a big part of what we do. We need to have clear incentives for us to be able to lend to green projects. We should have preferential tax treatment or no tax or something to be able to make sure the money disproportionately goes towards green investments. Otherwise, we are not going to get there fast enough. And yes, government should work to have mitigations in place. Yes, people will lose jobs. Yes, industries will get hit hard, and regions will get hit hard. For those people, we should put in the safety nets. We should upskill them. We should retrain them. We should do all those things. But we know how to do those things. Those are not new. And the main thing that we need to create, and that was a big lesson from Canterbury and from the COVID response, is we need to create some certainty and confidence and durability that government is there as a backstop. When we talk about climate change, when we talk about green buildings, when we talk about transport, when we talk about urban design, all of those things happen inside a box that is designated by government. We have to get government on board because we all know in this room what are the technical things that we must do. But we can't do it individually. If we want to push in the right direction together, we need to get government on board. And for that to happen, we also need to act as citizens together and say, climate change is a crisis that requires bold and urgent action. Thank you.
Gosh, he's good, isn't he? It makes me think maybe the economists should be in charge. And actually, on that note, there's a question here for you, Shamubeel. Kia ora, Shamubeel. If you were made Minister of Housing, Building and Construction and Climate Change tomorrow, what would be the first action you'd take?
What for action?
Just like you to come up with your policy agenda on the fly.
There is a 10-point plan. But essentially, the big thing for me is really around urban design, right? Urban form. If the urban form continues to be car dependent and about us living in Mac mansions in the far fringes of the city, it is not going to work. We've got to stop that from happening, and we've got to encourage and enable us to live closer together in nice amenities, close to work and close to stuff that we enjoy. So I don't think that stuff is actually very difficult. We already do it in lots of places quite well, but we've got to make it prevalent everywhere in New Zealand.
Just got to combat NIMBYism, right?
I will outlaw NIMBYism.
The next top question here for you, Shamubeel, is do you think that what happened with the COVID response is a clear sign we need to value the state more? Is it time for more state and less corporate?
That's a good question. I think the answer is yes. I think there is a role for government in things that corporates don't do. And that's fine, right? I don't think corporates don't do everything. And there are two big parts where government is really important, and it's around those public services, which I think we all enjoy, but it's also around the ability to create the rules and regulations So our ability to make sure the boundaries are correct is important, but also the role of catalyst. So if you look through history, both here and around the world, governments have been quite important in terms of being catalysts of basic research or different ways of living, different types of housing, transport, whatever. So government has a role in its ability to catalyze things. So for example, one of the things that Denise and I are very passionate about is build to rent. Build to rent in New Zealand is not going to happen if government doesn't come to the party and actually crack some heads together and create some rules, regulations, and funding. So you've got to create that kind of environment that's right. Now, I'm quite fearful of big government and the idea of big government like Muldoon. I keep, he's probably turning in his grave, the poor guy. But he has a lot to answer for, because there is big government and there is big government that is negligent. So we still need to make sure our public service is good quality and we have good checks and balances, because power is corrupting and big government has a very strong tendency towards corruption.
What are you expecting from the budget in a couple of weeks? Are you expecting transformational change, or is this public sector pay freeze we've just heard about an indication that it might be a black budget?
I'm braced for disappointment. But also because budgets are about $3 billion of new spending, but not the other 100 billions that we spend every year. Right? So this focus on the budget is stupid. It is such a marginal thing, it really doesn't do very much. The thing that really matters is not the incremental money that government spends, but it's the whole of the money that government spends and the rules, regulations, and priorities of what they choose to spend it on. So unless, I get quite frustrated by the budget day because people are like, oh, Shamubeel, what do you think about this? Like, why are you worried about $100 million here when we're wasting $1 billion over there? Or why are you worried about this little change here when the actual stock of money, that every year's commitment of money is so much bigger than that? People get so caught up in the minutiae and the change that they forget, they forget the context of what we're trying to do. But rules and regulations, far more important. The outcomes we're trying to achieve, far more important than the budget. So it really doesn't matter, but like I said, I'm braced for disappointment because the signals so far haven't been great.
I spent most of my journalistic career asking you about what was going to be in the budget, so I'm glad I was wasting my time. Please put your hands together for Shamubeel Eaqub.